Hello and welcome again to another video from Bible Class Topics. Today we continue our study of the Gospel of Matthew, and today we begin by looking at chapter 4. Here's a review of our outline that we're following in our study of Matthew. We've looked at the coming of the King. We'll conclude that today, and we'll begin the section entitled Proclaiming the Kingdom. The last thing we have to look at under the coming of the kingdom is his temptation, as we've already looked at his genealogy, his birth and early life, and his baptism in the previous 3 chapters. So we're going to talk about his temptation today. Let's read the first 11 verses of Matthew 4. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, and after fasting 40 days and 40 nights he was hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." And Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, "All these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me." Then Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him. The Greek word for tempt means test. God did not tempt Abraham in Genesis 22 verse 1 in our sense of the word, but he did test Abraham. What we call temptation is not something to make us sin, it is something to make us conquer sin. Jesus went into the wilderness to be alone to think about how he would accomplish his task. Could we use some time alone? Is there a time to stop acting and start thinking? Could we use some time alone with God? The purposes of this showdown between Satan and Christ might include: 1, Jesus must destroy the work of the devil. 2, testing helped him to be qualified as our high priest. 3, his example teaches us how to resist the devil. And 4th, the temptation shows insight into the devil's method. It might be good for you to pause the video and go and see what these passages I have listed have to offer. Jesus was the God-man. He was part God and part man. And when I say part, I actually mean he was all God and all man. How this works, it's hard to explain. And it's probably impossible to explain. But I want to talk about the fact that Jesus was able to be tempted because he was human. He was tempted to do evil. And his temptation proves his humanity. His temptation was a genuine conflict which he could have lost. For our sake, we are blessed that he did not lose to Satan in the face of temptation. We see from Mark chapter 1 verses 12 and 13 that the testing came quickly after his baptism. In that passage it says, immediately the Spirit drove him into the wilderness, and he was there in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and was with the wild beast, and then the angels came and ministered to him. You know, we are often at our most vulnerable after some success. It's hard not to think of Elijah the prophet. He defeated all those prophets of Baal. And then he became scared of Jezebel and went on the run. He was ripe to be scared because he had just had such a great success. This is a time when Satan will choose to strike us, right after we've had great success or great good things happen to us. Spiritual testing is often an inward experience. It takes place in our heart. It takes place in our mind and in our soul. The devil's power lies in the fact that he can breach our defenses and attack us from within. His allies lie within our thoughts and our desires. In James chapter 1 and verse 14, James, the Lord's brother, says, "But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed." This first temptation seemed reasonable. Jesus' desire for food was intense. He had been fasting 40 days and 40 nights. It reminds me of someone in the Bible who lost out to their desire for food, and that, of course, is Esau. Satan's solution was an easy solution. Just change this stone into bread. These are not the only times Jesus was tested by the tempter. I suggest you look up passages such as Matthew 16:23, Luke 22:28, and Luke 22:42 through 44. Jesus never reached a stage of spiritual maturity where he was beyond being tested. Why would we think we could attain such a place in our lives? We need Jesus to help us fight our spiritual battles. The devil chose temptations for Jesus that involved his supernatural powers. We must remember that we too will be tempted through our gifts. Are you charming? Do you have a way with words? Are you beautiful? Or are you smarter than the average bear? If so, this is where Satan will attack you. Jesus himself is probably the source of this story. This must be one of the things he shared with his apostles. This is his testimony. He will be able to help others in their struggles because he was able to overcome these temptations of Satan. The temptation to turn the stones to bread. This temptation was not only for Jesus to use his powers, but to use his powers selfishly. To produce bread now and during his ministry could have been a double mistake. It would be a bribe for men to follow him, but his call was one of giving, not getting. We'll see that after he fed the large crowds of 5,000 and 4,000, there were people that were following him not for his teaching, but just to try to get something else to eat. The answer lies in Deuteronomy 8:3, as quoted by Jesus, "Man will not live by bread alone." The temptation to throw himself off the pinnacle of the temple and yet remain unharmed. In Psalms 91, verses 11 and 12, it appears to commend this action to attract followers, because the psalm says, "For he shall give his angels charge over you, to keep you in all your ways. In their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone." But these type of miracles were the tactics of the false messiahs. They offered sensations they could not perform. Why should Jesus not one-up these pretenders? First, there's no future in this method. Men would constantly call on him to provide even bigger displays of power. Second, that is not the way to use God's power. See Deuteronomy 6 and verse 16. We are not to prove God's power by purposefully putting ourselves into harm's way, then expecting God to save us. God does not expect man to take risks to increase his own prestige. A faith that depends on signs and wonders is not true faith. If your faith depends on these type of signs, it is not faith. It is doubt looking for proof, and it's looking in the wrong place. Longing for sensations is not trusting God. It is actually distrusting God. The temptation to worship the devil. Satan wanted Jesus to compromise his morals to achieve an end. Look the other way. Let it slide. Everybody's doing it. In Deuteronomy 6:13, Jesus has a quote for Satan. Jesus knew that evil cannot be defeated through compromise. Christianity cannot stoop to the level of the world. Jesus determined to never bribe men through any means to gain their following, not by providing man's earthly means, not by using sensations as an attractant, and not by compromising the message he preached. These choices inevitably led him to the cross, but the cross inevitably guaranteed the final victory. Warren Wiersbe said, "One victory never guarantees freedom from further temptation. If anything, each victory we experience only makes Satan try harder." Now we'll begin our study of the section entitled Proclaiming the Kingdom. Under this section, I've divided it into 5 parts: the beginning of the Galilean ministry, the Sermon on the Mount, miracles of healing, sending forth the 12, and discourses and kingdom parables. To complete our study of Matthew chapter 4, we'll look at it under 5 topics. The Son of God goes forth, the herald of God, Christ calls the fishermen, the methods of the Master, and the activities of Jesus. I provided a little map that perhaps you can see. I'm not sure it's big enough, but I just wanted to show you the distance from like Jerusalem to Galilee, about 50 miles, 50 to 60 miles. And I want you to notice where Capernaum is located, because Jesus is going to take up residence there. Before we go any further, let's read a few more verses. I want to read verses 12 through 17. Now when he heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled: the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. And for those dwelling in the region and the shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. From that time Jesus began to preach, saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." We'll talk more about the disaster that befell John when we study Matthew 14, verses 3 through 12. Jesus moves on to Capernaum. Galilee was the most northerly district of Palestine, a territory 50 by 25 miles long and wide. Though small, Galilee was densely populated because it was fertile ground. The people of this region were open to new ideas. Well, why were they open to new ideas? Let me read you a quote from William Barclay, where he quotes Josephus, the Jewish historian. "But not only was Galilee a populous district, its people were people of a certain kind. Of all parts of Palestine, Galilee was most open to new ideas. Josephus says of the Galileans, they were ever fond of innovations, and by nature disposed to changes, and delighted in seditions. They were ever ready to follow a leader and to begin an insurrection. They were notoriously quick in temper and given to quarreling. Yet withal, they were the most chivalrous of men. The Galileans, said Josephus, have never been destitute of courage. Cowardice was never a characteristic of the Galileans. They were ever more anxious for honor than for gain. The inborn characteristics of the Galileans were such as to make them the most fertile ground for a new gospel to be preached to them." So Jesus has taken his gospel to the fertile ground, which is the region of Galilee. Before we talk more about Capernaum, let me say a few more words about Galilee. Galilee was literally surrounded by Gentiles. The Samaritans were on the south, the Syrians were on the north and the east, the Phoenicians were on the west. They were one part of Judea that would be most easily influenced by outside thinking. The great roads of the Middle East passed right through Galilee. Meanwhile, down in Judea, it was tucked away in the mountains and sheltered from foreign traffic. In its history, Galilee had often been invaded and conquered. Foreigners had been in and out of it many times through the years. It had belonged to Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun when Israel first came to Canaan. When the Assyrians took these tribes into captivity, they repopulated all this land with foreigners. And the Gentiles had largely controlled this land until the 2nd century BC. And finally, by 106 BC, Galilee was back in the hands of the Jews. As Barclay indicated, Galilee was ripe for a new teacher with a new message. Let's finish our discussion of verses 12 through 17 by talking about Jesus as the herald of God. Capernaum most likely stood on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. And it's there he began to proclaim his message. His voice held a note of certainty. True gospel preaching rings out with this note as well. His voice held a note of authority. He brought forth the king's law, command, and decision. His message came from a source beyond himself. The preacher should not express his own opinions, but should proclaim the good news according to the Scriptures. Jesus spoke to man with the voice of God. He called for repentance. Turn back to God. Walk towards God. Eternity and God had come to earth in the form of the God-man, Jesus Christ. There would be no better time for man to choose the right side and the right direction. Let's read verses 18 through 22. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father, and they followed him. In the 1st century, the Sea of Galilee was busy with commerce and especially fishing. 3 types of fishing were generally practiced: fishing by line, fishing by dragnet, and fishing by casting net. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were handling cast nets when Jesus called them. Jesus had already met some of these men when they were following John the Baptist. You can see the 1st chapter of John's Gospel. Jesus chose these ordinary working men to be his disciples and later his apostles. You know, there are characteristics that might make a good fisherman a good fisher of men. I have 7 to share. 1, patience. Fishing of any kind takes time. And perseverance. You can't become discouraged. Speaking of not being discouraged, you have to have courage. You have to be willing to face the fury when you tell a man the truth. Regardless of what kind of fisherman you are, you have to have an eye for the right moment, when to cast and when to wait. And you have to fit the bait to the fish. You have to become all things to all men. When we used to go fishing with my dad, he would always try to keep us from throwing our shadow over the water. The good fisherman knows how to keep himself out of sight. And if I'm a good fisherman for Jesus, I have to put all the glory on Jesus and none on myself. It's about Jesus. It's not about the preacher. And a good fisherman has to be able to mend his own equipment. If you have a chance, you might want to take a look at Galatians 6:1, 1 Thessalonians 3:10, and 1 Peter 5:10 and see what Paul the Apostle and Simon Peter have to say. Let's conclude our reading of the chapter, beginning in verse 23. And he went throughout all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. While there was only one temple, which was set aside for sacrifice, every community had its own synagogue, which was set aside for teaching. The synagogue service included prayers, readings from the law and the prophets, then an address. The president of the synagogue would determine who would speak. After the address, then there would be questions and discussions. Jesus went, healed the sick from near and far. They came from Syria. They came from Galilee, Judea. They came from across the Jordan. Do we think there were only Jews in these crowds? It's highly unlikely. We'll conclude our study of chapter 4 by talking about the activities of Jesus. He came proclaiming, that is, preaching the gospel. He came teaching in the synagogues. Not only was he proclaiming the good news, he was also explaining it. And he came healing the sick. Yes, he came preaching. Why? To defeat men's ignorance of God and his will. And he came teaching to defeat men's understanding, to defeat men's misunderstanding. He explained true religion. Finally, he came healing to defeat men's pain. An ideal is not helpful until it is realized. Jesus realized his own teaching and preaching by helping and healing. Furthermore, he confirmed his teaching and preaching by using these miracles as we've listed above in Matthew 11, Mark 16, and Hebrews 2. The primary goal of his healings was to prove that he was the Messiah, the true Son of the living God. Next time, we'll begin our study of Matthew chapter 5. Thank you for watching. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And please share this video with your family and friends. Until we meet again, may God bless you.